The title moderator always makes me nervous because I'm trying to figure out what the verb there is, if I'm supposed to moderate everyone that's here, and that's not actually my goal. I hope they give it to us with both fists. I'm grateful to be here. You know, this topic of science and politics. You know, a lot of this conference met with science, but the truth is, I think a lot of this really is it's a political issue. They always talk about the scientific consensus, but the truth is there is not a scientific consensus, as you know. What there really is, though, there appears to be a political consensus, and I would say that because if you look at the eventual nominee for both of the major parties, there's, I guess, 3 people vying for that totality of those 2 positions. All of them seem to be hook, line, and sinker of the political belief that we have to do something about global warming right now, including taxing the daylights and regulating the daylights out of America. So to me, this particular topic is very important, even though I have spent a lot of my life believing that climate change was primarily a scientific topic. It is on one level, but the truth is, on another level, it is primarily a political issue. You know, it began, I think, with, we probably took some false hope in the Byrd-Hagel amendment years ago that looked so impressive, and then over time now we have, you know, we've had McCain-Lieberman and now Warner-Lieberman, and we have the EPA contemplating a regulatory regime that would make Kyoto look like a walk in the park. And it becomes clear that politics is very fluid, and you know, 97 to nothing votes don't mean much when you're looking at politics, because a few years later things are very different. You know, we're told, of course, that the debate is over and the science is certain, and yet they certainly don't behave that way. You know, Al Gore won't agree to show up unless he's the only one with a microphone. And when he appeared before the Senate almost a year ago, he refused to provide his testimony in advance, as is generally required by the Senate rules, so that the Senate can be prepared for the testimony he'd give and have proper questions. Again, because he doesn't want questions. So to me, it is odd for a group that insists the debate is over and that science is certain to behave this way, because their own actions belie their silly assertions. And I think you'll hear several different things today that will help make all of this very clear. But I think ultimately, from a political perspective, scientists probably worry about the first question, the first 2 questions here, which is, is the climate changing, and B, is man responsible for it? But in politics, you also have to ask this question after those 2, which is if a climate, and that's assuming, of course, you get a yes answer to both those first 2 questions, which, as we all know, that is not apparently the, well, our temperature's rising, perhaps, but even so, the last 10 years, that's not clear. Perhaps, you know, up till 1998, the answer. But then, you know, are we responsible? As one person said, if you were to look at one of these skyscrapers and ask what's responsible, how tall it is, man's contribution to the CO2 level in the atmosphere, it was argued that would be the thickness of linoleum as compared to the height of the skyscraper. At any rate, though, this next question, of course, is this increase a bad thing? You know, is it a problem? Is this something that we need to craft policy solutions to fix? And then finally, does it mean we need more regulations and more taxes? And again, I think that becomes very unlikely. At any rate, I think the critical thing now is for us to turn to our panelists, and we will first hear from Dr. Michael Fox. And I am grateful to have, he's a scientist, and he has a great deal of expertise in the, I've misplaced my, well, let me borrow that, there we go. Anyhow, Dr. Fox is an expert in nuclear energy, and he is someone who comes at this with a great deal of knowledge from the nuclear side of things, and he will begin to explain the politics and how it relates to the nuclear issue. Because in America, it's a funny issue, which is we talk about doing something about climate change, and yet the only kind of form of energy we have that works is one that, at least for those who fight climate change the most, it's off limits. Yeah. So, Dr. Fox.
Well, I would like to first of all thank very much the Heartland Institute and all of the supporters for putting on this terrific conference. it is very important, and I want you all to appreciate how important this kind of a conference is. I guess it would be point number one. We never had anything like this in the nuclear industry, and I'm going to get more into that in a minute. And I would also like to thank the Evergreen Freedom Foundation for letting me sponsor or represent them here. When the term moderator was mentioned a few minutes ago, it lit up my world in a very different way, because moderators are an intimate part of reactor physics, and they're used for slowing down neutrons. I'm going to be describing my experiences in communication with the public on behalf of the nuclear industry, because I see a lot of similarities between the nuclear industry and its opponents, as well as the proponents of anthropogenic global warming. And I wanted to point out some of these experiences and to point out a lot of things that are being done right with respect to conferences like this. What we're dealing with, let's see if I can learn to operate this properly. Where's it down? There we go. What we're dealing with in the United States is what I call all-around illiteracy. The declining quality of public education across the United States is just appalling. We coming in 25th out of 29th in international competition of science and math. And I'll give you an example. I have lots of experiences about questions in the public. But I was giving a talk one time, and afterwards a retired teacher came to me and said, well, I guess I don't agree with you, Dr. Fox. I don't think we really have an electrical supply problem, and if we do, I'll just install more outlets and be done with my problem. So lots of anecdotes like that. Michael Crichton is one of my favorite authors and one of the few fiction writers that I'll spend more than 20 minutes with. Points out the greatest challenge facing mankind today is distinguishing reality from fantasy, truth from propaganda. Perceiving the truth has always been a challenge for mankind, and in the information age, or as I like to think of it, the disinformation age, it takes on a special urgency and importance, and that cannot be clearer than in the climate issue. There are crucial differences between science and politics, and when we discuss climate politics and restricting our energy supplies of fossil fuel, by the way, let me point out that this is the same movement that has been opposed to nuclear power for 30 years and has been opposed to hydropower in the Northwest. Some of you may not realize that they're fighting tooth and toenail to save major dams on the Snake River right now. And now they're opposed to fossil fuel use. And so it's incumbent upon us to recognize what the exercise is. How many of you do not know the name Maurice Strong? Raise your hands. Never have heard of him. Okay? There's one person in the room who not only knows him, but has met him, my good friend here, Floy Lilly. And you may wish to corner her sometime in the hall today about who Maurice Strong is. He's a billionaire Canadian socialist who has been behind the throne at the UN for many, many, many years and many, many, many secretaries general. And he said this at the original meeting of the United Nations Environmental Program in Rio in '92, which gave birth to the IPCC, by the way. He says, "Isn't it the only hope for the planet that industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about?" Now, it's difficult for me to point fingers and call names and ascribe some sort of political agenda to some of our opponents. But when they come right out and tell you what the agenda is, that is very, very troubling. Here it is. And another one. There's a clearly stated agenda behind the UN's leadership, and it exists with many national and international leaders. I have just completed reading John Bolton's book, Surrender is Not an Option, and he describes the inner workings of the UN in such a way that is completely consistent with what Maurice Strong had to say. Gro Harlem Brundtland, which I think Mark mentioned yesterday, said that it is irresponsible, reckless, and deeply immoral to question the seriousness of the situation. The time for diagnosis is over, and the time to act is now. She's worn many hats internationally, and she is now one of the UN's IAEA experts. And all of these environmental, I forgot to tell you, and it wasn't mentioned anywhere, I was on the left 30, 40 years ago. And I sent my checks into Sierra Club and Greenpeace and Audubon Society and a few groups like that. So I know what the drill is. So what happened to me is my degrees in math and physical chemistry and 37 years in the nuclear business taught me that these folks weren't being truthful anymore, and I long since have left. But the recipe for the environmental movement is three steps. Identify a looming catastrophe, identify the cause, and for the sake of mankind, get rid of the cause. It's over and over and over again. For the nuclear industry, it's radiation and waste. Throw in proliferation, if you will. For DDT, it was cancer, saving the wildlife, and whatever. And the way to get rid of that is to ban these things. But I also have some expertise in risk analysis, and risk typically is not a zero-sum game. What I mean by that is if we get rid of nuclear power, if we get rid of hydro, if we get rid of coal for electricity, are we actually reducing the risks to society? And the answer to that is obviously no, because in getting rid of the risk, we're throwing away huge benefits, which comes from the widespread use of electricity. Mark Mills is one of my favorite experts on this subject, but he pointed out very quietly about a year ago, most people don't realize it, but in buildings in our towns, very innocuous, sometimes unpainted concrete buildings without hardly any windows, contain thousands and thousands of computer servers. And this is what makes the internet run. They're quietly located in our communities, and they contain these servers by the thousands. And they now consume somewhere between 9 and 10% of the total electrical demand in the United States. And it's growing. And so anyone who wants to propose throwing up unreliable, uneconomic windmills, these things require spectacularly high quality kilowatt hours, not these random kilowatt generators. They need high quality in terms of voltage, high quality in terms of frequency. And you don't get those out of the alternative energy options. Well, the case against hydro, of course, they always have to have a catastrophe. And the case against hydro is that they're destroying the salmon runs. Now, mind you, in the last few years, we've had record-setting salmon returns to the Columbia River and its drainage. And furthermore, we have hatcheries up and down the river, which are genetically identical to the wild fish. But the wild fish occupy in their minds a higher calling, if you will, a greater importance. And so they have lined up lawyers and money and regional federal judges to support their cause, which is a very big menace to even the hydro. Okay, I'm not going to talk about nuclear energy today, although I could go on for hours. It's not because I don't support it. Of course I support it. When I was in graduate school in the 60s, I realized then that the nuclear power option wins the environmental debate hands down, even without CO2 considerations. So, but that's not the subject of my talk. I have been out in the hustings for hundreds and hundreds of speeches, hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and I've been up against the Greens a lot, which is another story. What I have learned is I have been through a lot of formal communication education, and I wanted to make a lot of you aware of this. I used to be the shy, inhibited, afraid to speak kind of guy, but one thing, you get over that with experience, and I got over it because I know my subject really well. And I went up against some formidable Greens. Who was the guy here from Portland yesterday, the Cascade? Yeah, I beat, what was he? The fiercest and foremost anti-nuke in Oregon, Lloyd Marbet. Yeah, I beat him to death. Beat him to death because the vote was recorded in about page 55 in the Portland Oregonian in type 2 font, but the people voted in my favor 220 to 90 or something. But it's important to know that you can get training in this area. There's media training, and there is risk communication training. And the media training is really interesting. One of the best in the United States is right here, who teaches in sociology or psychology at CCNY. He only gave us a 1 or 2 week course in communication, risk communication. But he has a full semester course here at CCNY, a semester course in this kind of communication. And the Greens take this education. And to get an A out of his course, and he told me this personally, to get an A out of his course, the students had to learn to cry upon call. So that when you are being interviewed, Meet the Press, you can bring up a teary eye in support of your cause. And they've learned a long time ago in the acting business that this creates all sorts of empathy for you and your mission and your message. It's that deceptive and that willful. All right, to communicate well, you need to know the subject matter extremely well, but knowledge is not sufficient. There was a man in here yesterday from Brazil, and he had a question about an audience that he ran into someplace that I would describe as maybe a little bit hostile. And it's very, very important to know what kind of an audience you're going to go up against. If you have a sympathetic audience, like your buddies at Rotary or whatever, then you can start delivering your message immediately about what you want to get across. But if you're dealing with a slight bit of hostility, then there's a whole different way to answer and behave. And you're trained to do that. I'm not going to get into the tactics, but it's a whole different process, whether you're in a hostile or non-hostile environment. Just want to make you aware of that. We also need to know who our opponents are and what their tactics are. You know, football teams have scouting reports. Baseball teams have scouting reports. Who can hit the inside pitch, outside pitch, upper pitch, lower pitch. I mean, they have books on these guys. And we should have the same kind of information on the opposition. And they develop many, many tactics to oppose nuclear power. And I will only mention one. Or I will mention 3 and then break it down. The 3 general areas of attack on the nuclear industry was in regulation, litigation, and Art Robinson likes to also mention the 3rd corner, which is taxation. But the regulation of the nuclear industry has been appalling. For those of you who don't know, General Electric can build well, they're big now, a 1,300 megawatt nuclear power plant in Japan for about 1/3 the money and 1/3 the cost that GE can build in the United States. And the reason for that is the Japanese don't have to deal with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and they don't have to deal with the Washington State Utility Commission or other these PUCs around the U.S. That's where the big problems are. And so consider what we call the LNT. The LNT is the linear no threshold theory of harm to humans based on radiation. And the linear theory says you can measure the harm at very high doses, which no one disputes, for heaven's sakes, and you can strap it all the way to zero and have a defensible explanation of the relationship between health effects and radiation dose. And that's not true. At lower doses, there is no measurable, observable deleterious effect of radiation. We have people living in many cities around the world. Ramsar, Iran comes to mind right now, where people live in high levels of radon, 20 to 30 rem, for those of you who know the numbers, which, on round numbers, it's 100 times more than the doses that we experience within the nuclear industry. 100 times. And yet, there have been health studies done of people in Ramsar, Iran, and there's no observable adverse health effects, even at those high doses. And many of the experts have pointed this out. Lawrence Taylor has, he would have won a Nobel Prize if there had been an award in health physics, but he pointed out that the use of the LNT is a deeply immoral use of our scientific heritage. And same thing for Gunnar Wallander, the greatest scientific scandal of the 20th century. Now, I have to cut these guys a little bit of slack because those statements were written before the global warming thing was on us. But we have a lot of scientific scandals historically. And Rosalind Yallo, whom I flew out to, I organized a conference out in the state of Washington some years ago, said the unjustified excessive concern with radiation at any level precludes the beneficial uses of radiation and radioactivity in medicine, science, and industry. I could go on for hours about those benefits. I learned a long time ago that this world of politics is not this simple. I had an audience with a Washington State congressman one time. He was not of my party, but he's the kind of guy I liked. He was no nonsense, no prisoners kind of guy. That's what I like. He says, in my district, it is political suicide to be rational on nuclear issues. Now think about that. Political suicide to be rational. They can't even have a discussion of nuclear energy in these districts. And therefore, we can never expect very much leadership out of our elected officials. You can't expect Senator Patty Murray from Washington, even if she is so predisposed. You can't expect her to stand up and start reading pages out of a nuclear engineering text and explaining why it's safe and how it works, because that's political suicide. You can't expect the leaders to do that. So we have to work harder at generating political support. All right, never let your worst enemies publicly define who you are. Never. If somebody's bad-mouthing you, fix it. And never let your enemy carry your own messages to the public. And the use of the internet, the blogs and websites and networks are pivotal. And this could be, this could change the whole dynamic. I sense that somebody's got the hook here for me, so all right. When I was in Hawaii, I got to interview Patrick Moore of Greenpeace and got a great hour with him. He stated, too few Americans and too few media people know anything about the environmental movement and its transformation over the past 35 years into something vastly different. Moore continued, they, the Greens, have become more extreme and whose politics is little more than neo-Marxism in green garb. And as a former leftist, I can vouch for that. They tend to be strongly anti-human. I think withholding DDT from millions of Africans is a great example of anti-humanism. anti-science, anti-technology, anti-trade, anti-capitalism, anti-business, anti-civilization, and invariably misleading. In respect for you and my fellow panelists, I am going to skip ahead to a conclusion. To ration or eliminate the large sources of fossil energy in our economy at a time when these same political forces oppose nuclear and hydroelectric, totaling more than 98% of our total electrical capacity, is dangerous. One of my favorite guys, I thought he was going to be here, Art Robinson. The global power to tax and ration energy is the power to control the world, to have life and death control over every human being on the planet. No government should ever have that power. Thank you very much.